Hello and welcome to another edition of the Beta Kit podcast. I'm Douglas Saltis, editor-in-chief of Beta Kit, and along with my co-host Rob Kennedy, I'm in Montreal for Startup Fest. As such, we're re-airing one of our past episodes while Rob and I network. Yeah, that's what we're doing. We're networking. Now, we know how popular our VC interviews have been, so today you're listening to us speak with Paul Lacerte, managing partner of Raven Indigenous Capital Partners, an Indigenous-led and focused VC firm in Canada. This episode originally aired on Canada's first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, September 30th, which is also Orange Shirt Day. Since then, there's been a lot of consternation amongst Canadian tech about downturns, down rounds, and layoffs. So much so that you might have forgotten that the second National Day for Truth and Reconciliation is fast approaching. How much has changed in the reconciliation economy in the last year? Well, Calgary-based Virtual Gurus raised an $8.4 million Series A round in March. Led by CEO Bobby Reset, it's one of the first Series A rounds closed by an Indigenous woman in Canadian tech history. Oh, and wouldn't you know it, Raven happens to be in that round. Seems like a good time to check back in with what Paul had to say last September. So let's dig in.
As an Indigenous person, I'm certainly feeling, I think, an appropriate amount of disillusionment with the public discourse.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Beta Kit podcast. I am Douglas Saltis, editor-in-chief of Beta Kit, and my co-host, as always, is Rob Kennedy, entrepreneur in residence at TWG. Those words you just heard were from Paul Lacerte, managing partner of Raven Indigenous Capital Partners, an Indigenous-led and focused VC firm in Canada. The firm's mandate is to solve the lack of access to capital to what Lacerte refers to as Indigenous impact entrepreneurs in a culturally safe way. There's a lot of reasons for that lack of access due to issues with collateralizing debt, trust, and what Lacerte called a trauma relationship with money. It's safe to say that Raven is looking for a different type of returns than any other VC in Canada, and Lacerte articulates those on this episode, as well as how the firm uses the traditional framework of VC to achieve them. Now, in a traditional sense, Lacerte almost has an unfair first-mover advantage with a huge untapped potential market. But on this new national holiday, that's not really the point. Raven Capital wants to invest in the reconciliation economy. Here now is Guillaume Guillot to tell you why.
We should have been and have been in a state of shock, and I think a pretty high level of consternation and navel gazing, about who we are as a society and what the path forward needs to look like in the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And it changed. You start talking about kids that go to school that didn't survive their experience of going to elementary school, and that schools were built and they built graveyards at the same time they built the schools. And if you did that in today's world, that would not be something that would be acceptable. So the fact that it went from, front page news and I think top of mind for Canadians to a non-issue in the public discourse around this election is incredibly frustrating for me, and I think can easily lead folks to draw the conclusion that elected officials in this country really lack the courage to take a stand on an issue that isn't a winning election issue. We're only 4.8% of the population, so we don't elect governments. And the trajectories from elections really do get set, and expectations of what the priorities will be do get established. And that hasn't happened in this election. And so for a lot of us in Indigenous communities, we are increasingly looking to the social economy, to the investment sector, to the private sector, to drive the kind of solutions that we need and enable the innovators in Indigenous communities that we need to be able to break out of that paradigm that it's really our relationship with the Crown that where the solution space is, and shift to, we have the answers. We just need to fuel up our people with the capital that they need to be able to, make that change, happen, notwithstanding the albatross that is the many governments in this country at many levels. And that's kind of what's been inspiring me, I think, to be part of the journey at Raven Capital, and to find what is now a plethora of investors who are wanting to lean into the reconciliation economy and vote with their dollar. And we seem to be having some momentum in that space. So it's a little bit of a silver lining in this big dark cloud that's hanging over this guy.
Well, let's start there, and let's just get into it, because I think you've probably set the context better than I ever could. But honestly, that's why we're having you on the podcast. I would say, for our audience listening to this is being recorded 4 days before an election that really no one asked for or wanted, and the outcome to us is heretofore unknown. But I think to pick up the thread there, Paul, what you're saying about that shift away from government impact to private impact through enterprise and investment, and what you're doing with Raven Capital is probably a really good way for you to describe to our audience maybe what the mandate is and what Raven Capital is about. So why don't you just kind of walk us through that, where the fund is, and we can kind of just unspool from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So we founded Raven Capital really as an Indigenous owned and Indigenous led financial intermediary in Canada to facilitate the flow of capital towards, solutions in the Indigenous space. And the first undertaking was to raise the first ever Indigenous owned impact fund in Canada, for sure in North America, and perhaps anywhere in the world. Our target was a small $5 million fund, and primarily through the pandemic period, we ended up raising and closing a $25 million fund. And what we were trying to solve for was the lack of access to capital by Indigenous impact focused entrepreneurs, and not just access to capital, but access to patient, flexible, culturally safe, gender safe capital. And that's in large part because Indigenous entrepreneurs often have a hard time collateralizing debt, and inclusive of structural limitations for financial institutions to allow on reserve assets to serve as collateral. And also, for many of us who are intergenerational residential school survivors, when we go to a friends and family round, most of the people we talk to have a negative net worth, and so those pockets aren't nearly as deep in Indian country. And
is there any cultural aversion to that debt or those processes either? I know one thing that's triggered for me, just from what you're saying, in my own entrepreneurial journey, was how I grew up and how I was raised made me see debt as a point of shame. And it wasn't until I talked to other entrepreneurs that had a completely different experience from me, who saw it as just an asset class that they could pursue. I was like, oh, if this isn't a burden that I should be looking to pay back, this is an actual facility I can use. Is there a cultural consideration there, or is it more just the socioeconomic lack of access that's really inhibiting that?
Well, I would say two things. One is that there is a trauma relationship with money and Indigenous people writ large, and that's mostly informed by poverty and intergenerational and structural lack of access to including debt. So yeah, I would say that there is more of a gap or a disconnect with equity. And in fact, equity for Indigenous entrepreneurs is a little bit like a unicorn, you hear about it, but you don't see it, and or you haven't experienced it. And so, yeah, bringing an equity-based fund to market and socializing that amongst Indigenous entrepreneurs, what we learned was not so much about their relationship with debt, to your question. It was more that they couldn't really believe that there was access to non-collateralized capital where we were really investing in them, and building a relationship. And even though we show up from an Indigenous place, try as best as possible to use an Indigenous lexicon and approach it from a very relational and less of a transactional perspective, it still takes a ton of time to build the trust that we need to overcome some of that trauma relationship with money so that people feel comfortable to get into business, even though we're an Indigenous-led firm. So there's still a lot of work to do in that context.
I'd be interested to know how you think venture, quote unquote, venture failure is deemed, not just the debt part of it, but also like, what does a successful entrepreneur look like in at least the sort of hip tech bro culture? It's, I failed 37 times, but then on the 38th time, that's considered a badge of honor. Weirdly, I'm curious on two things. One is, how do you think that is perceived? I know it's early days, but secondly, how do you define success for the fund? It's not like we've had 37 IPOs. Isn't that amazing? I feel like it's a little more nuanced than that. Do you want to describe how you know you're successful?
Yeah, Rob, the narrative that we're trying to smash is that Indigenous people are lack capacity. This is this intergenerational broken narrative about our people. And so those permissions, particularly since there are so many Indigenous women that are driving sort of this cohort of Indigenous, entrepreneurship, this explosion that's happening in Canada right now, the permission to fail is something that is really non-existent for us and certainly, represents a danger of reinforcing some of those narratives. And for non-Indigenous Canadians, including investors who see the Indigenous venture capital space as having risk written all over it, then that's a huge opportunity for them to substantiate those underlying assumptions, which
bias,
it's really crazy. And so for us, what success looks like is being able to prove at a fund level, being able to prove that healthy returns are possible alongside Indigenous defined impact, and that we're shifting the entire relationship from that kind of like grind bro culture reality to something that looks a lot more like love and healing. And sometimes that shows up in a really interesting way with investment committees when we say part of our promise of a blended return is that our work is going to be love centered, that it's going to facilitate healing, that trust and Indigenous impact measurement and the well-being of Indigenous families sits alongside risk and return. And in fact, in our fund, sits significantly above risk and return as investment considerations. It's been a really pleasant surprise to see that there is a huge appetite to lean into that investment space.
Let's dig into that for a little bit, just because I think there's multiple things to tease out there. I really want to make sure that we dig in and discuss what it means to truly defining the impact, not only from the fund, but then also you keep talking about impact entrepreneurs. And I know there's more there than just successful business, but I just want to even go back in terms of how forthright Raven is about the targets of what it's aligned towards. And I think Canada as a whole, VC funds, there has been a dearth of public sharing of data related to how successful the funds actually are and the returns they're bringing and that they're measuring towards. I know, speaking to BetaKit team members in the past, like Raven's been very upfront, like we are targeting a slightly lower IRR because it's not pole position in the ultimate goal of the fund. Could you just walk us through I don't want to say the balancing act because I don't want to set it up as a false choice, but you just clearly articulated that there are higher priorities in there. How do you then use the framework of VC to ensure that you can achieve your objectives while also making sure that like the LP structure functions so that you can have a fund 2 and a fund 3 and keep this thing moving? Are there different considerations there?
Yeah, absolutely. So we, as you said, we've been, crystal clear with folks that we're not promising Silicon Valley type returns, which is most often empty promises anyway. What we are offering originally was 4 to 6% targeted IRR, and that's gone up to 6 to 8%, which we think is reasonably competitive. But more importantly, this dual promise of deploying capital with a high level of discipline and doing all of our work in a way that centers Indigenous ways of knowing and being, which is profoundly and transformatively different than what the venture space looks like. And I'll give you an example. One of our first investments was in Cheekbone Beauty. And so Jen Harper, who is an incredible entrepreneur, went on Dragon's Den and had asked for $100,000 for 20% of her company. And one of the dragons offered her $125,000 for 50% of her company, immediately giving her a suggested $250,000 valuation. Thankfully, we had been in conversations with her and agreed to do a much larger unsecured convertible note. And then we spent about 8 months just working with her and doing value creation and bringing the valuation of her company to a level where our equity position would be reasonably, leave as much value in her pocket as possible, and then convert, after we've spent a ton of time building trust and a relationship, helping her establish a board and taking a board seat and getting to know her family and her revenues went, and increased by 10 times in the first 12 months post investment with virtual gurus and another incredible Indigenous woman, Bobby Reset. She was passed over by 170 investors. Following our investment, the value of her company has increased 8x valuation, 8x in the last year. And she's on a rocket ship. And so what we're demonstrating is that while there are moderate promises around financial returns, the impact returns is something that consumers and other investors are moving towards in droves. And that demand side is going to result in, I think, really transformative returns. So we're in the underpromise, overdeliver game.
Yeah. Okay. Let's pin on that, because there's a lot of VCs that have been on this podcast on BetaK that'll talk about how they get in the trenches with entrepreneurs and they're operator led and blah, blah, blah. That this, in a cynical lens, could be seen as something similar. But I think what you're talking about is something more like, are you talking about like these multiples? Are these companies that are being spectacularly undervalued, or are there companies that have a ton of untapped value that just need some support mechanisms, guidance to kind of get that in motion to that point where you're kind of investing in someone that you can walk a path with to unlock that value?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I don't think the answer is a right fit to the question. But just give me a second.
Yeah, just riff on it. This is a late night podcast recording. This is generally how we do.
Yeah, groovy. One of the things we did right out of the gate was designed our own impact measurement framework, and as we look in the impact space, it's a dog's breakfast of people trying to understand what a positive ESG screen looks like. And so it was important for us right from day one to think about the desired future state as a result of the outputs and the outcomes being generated by the company, and to have a pretty high level of discipline around that and excellence around that, so that what we're bringing to market is as much about pride and a sense of connection and a sense of belonging and a decolonization and healing process for Indigenous people, and that we can draw a straight line in terms of attribution to our support. So this is just in the context of unlocking the value for with and for an entrepreneur. A big part of the capacity is supporting them to articulate their theory of change, the desired future state, and the contribution that they're making to a reconciliation economy in a way that makes sense and is meaningful for Indigenous people and is meaningful for customers and other investors who start to get it. The penny starts to drop about why this is different and why an Indigenous reconciliation economy has so much traction, but also has so much integrity and is so different than folks that want to get into the trenches to be able to drive returns. returns are a lower priority for us, but the impact that we're driving towards is also at a place and time in our country that is there's just this huge thirst for it. So I don't know if that answers the question or not, but
no, I think it really does. And it leads into the other side of the coin there that we were talking about when you were referring to Indigenous impact entrepreneurs, really understanding what that means. This isn't like we are here to help Indigenous entrepreneurs cash out. But there is a additional consideration in what their entrepreneurship is driven towards that has an outcome itself beyond just financial returns, either in the focus of the business or in what the business's growth and scale unlocks. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Also, it's what I heard also from you is that often in startup language, you're like, what's your unfair advantage? And it sounds like you've sort of hit on an unfair advantage where you've got insight. You and the entrepreneurs you work with have insights into kind of almost like a purposefully ignored blind spot of
Dramatically.
Yeah, dramatically and purposefully ignored blind spot. And it sounds like that thesis is paying off. I'm curious to know, tell us about the LPs, the people who you got to invest. Where do they come from? How are they across sector? Go ahead.
Do they agree with your philosophy?
Well, my assumption is they do. Otherwise, they wouldn't write a check. But it's a good question.
LPs in Canada are weird, man.
True.
I wouldn't take
That's
that
true.
as granted.
That's true.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the philanthropic investors, the high net worth investors, and the few sort of financial institutions here and in the United States that have invested in the fund are really mission driven and fully mission aligned and have almost uniformly said to us that they've been looking for investable Indigenous products, and there are just none out there that are Indigenous owned and that have the institutional capacity to not pick winners, but pick opportunities where there is integrity around the impact that we're looking to have and working backwards from that. And if there's been anything of a secret sauce or a pixie dust in this fund, it has been that alignment where people want to have a positive impact on the quality of life for Indigenous people. And that is the primary driver. Every 6 months, we have an Indigenous impact feast. And in the Zoom world, we get 40 or 50, all of our investors, all of our portfolio CEOs, some elders, and then I host an impact feast. And, before people know it, we have a sacred fire, we have drumming and singing. Everybody receives a feast package where they're gifted with, traditional, and it goes to their home. So all of our investors receive like a little feast package of like, I'm a moose hunting family, so they get a little bit of moose jerky and like this. And next thing you know, we're on this call and investors start to have the experience that Indigenous culture is about being in relationship, which is just like so profoundly different, to the extent that when we're doing impact measurement work, we engage with our LPs and interview them to see if they're being impacted, which is also really interesting and something that we get feedback that they're not used to thinking about impact from the context of like, how is your quality of life being improved as a result of being in relationship, not just with the Raven team, but with these entrepreneurs, and being in relationship with your understanding about the desired future state, so that you're not just replicating imperialism thinly veiled as benevolence, and I've done my good thing. I'm helping natives and I'm going to heaven. And the authenticity and the genuine interest to have a positive impact and to lean into a learning journey it's been remarkable to see, even some of them showing up as being vulnerable and then leaving that experience and going to other investors and saying, this is why I'm in this line of work in the first place. And this is the kind of impact that we're trying to have, but 10 times over,
It sounds like community. Hey CTOs, are you so endlessly focused on building your app or website that you barely have any time to focus on cloud adoption? Maybe you're not quite ready to hire a full-time employee to take on that burden? Why not partner with Duca, an independent Canadian cloud consulting company? With pay-as-you-go pricing, Duca's AWS experts provide you with the best approach to cloud adoption and respond quickly to your needs so your business can run smoothly. Keep your head out of the cloud and focus on your business by booking your free discovery call at duca.ca. That's DIUCA.ca. This idea of like a reconciliation economy. I know that on, and as we approach this day, which is this apparently national day that, depending upon what province you're in, is being either recognized in a fulsome way or not. On Canada Day, we had Jarrett Lehman publish an op-ed for we use the term ecosystem far too much on BetaKit. It's completely overused. But for our ecosystem, an op-ed about the need for Canadian tech to embrace reconciliation. And a huge component of that was the idea of collaboration. And I think indicating some of the things you're drawing towards. I'm just wondering for you as we kind of move towards this. I don't know if it's a holiday, if it's a national day of something, hopefully reconciliation. What that looks like to you within this Canadian tech ecosystem. Is it more of what you're doing at Raven, but not solely driven by Raven? Are there other components or considerations to this that need to be addressed? Like, what would make your life as a VC or as a person in Canada easier? I know, this is why we do it late in the evening. We just take big swings.
It's so good, man. It's so good. One of the impact questions that we ask to our portfolio companies in trying to understand the answer to your question is, what do you think the effect on your grandchildren is going to be and what do you think they're going to say as a result of the way that you're deploying the medicine? You're deploying your medicine through your enterprise, and what do you think your grandchildren are going to say? And Anamiki is an outstanding example of an Indigenous tech firm. We invested with them. They had 3 employees. They now have 38. That was a year and a half ago. They're a national beacon of what Indigenous integrity looks like. Again, it's why people want to do business with them. And the answer was, I want for my grandchildren to say, as they identify as an Indigenous person, the response is, oh, then you must be really good at tech. So he's two generations away. And this guy is like, he's laser focused on having, and to your point, an ecosystem wide transformative impact, so that this broken deficit lens that people think like Indigenous people need so much help, that is just replaced by, wow, Indigenous people are blowing up in the tech space and recolonizing the virtual space in a way that is more culturally safe, more gender safe, undoing some of the gender dominant way to the language that you used before. The
white tech bros. No, I'm completely fine calling it out.
Spirit and intent of the space is being recolonized in a new way. So and also, some of those structural barriers that we talked about earlier that result from the statutory relationship that our people have with the rest of the country, that some of that is being broken down as well. So we have it in the portfolio. One Feather Technologies, and they're launching a digital banking solution that also has, the ability to renew your status card on your phone and vote for chief and council on your phone and bank in a way so that you don't ever have to go into a physical branch and get arrested because you're trying to open up a bank account with your granddaughter,
Which is, sorry, for any listener that doesn't know, that story isn't a hypothetical, is a thing that happened, and you should read the reporting on it.
Yeah. For the tech sector is just occupied by people, and my across the board encouragement is for folks and your listeners to baseline yourself on where are you at, A, in the way that you think and feel about Indigenous people, B, the way that you are engaging. And that is, at an institutional level, at a policy level, and C, set some targets, because better is possible and necessary for everybody. And please do not make it our people's responsibility to facilitate your learning journey. The very first thing that most institutions and change makers often do is like, well, let's get a hold of some of the Indigenous people in our community and consult with them. And, there's just so much available, including, podcasts like this that people can look to, training courses that people can look to without making that initial mistake of reaching out to Indigenous people and being like, hey, can you help us with this? And
well, to that point, because I don't want this one podcast episode to be the be all and end all of that process.
No.
The op-ed that Jarrett provided, they did the labor to provide a series of lists of training courses, links, reading materials there. So if you are looking for that, we'll add it into the show notes so that listeners can check that out, because it's kind of already been provided for our audience on BetaKit at least. Okay, well, so I wonder where maybe we take this question next. And I also don't, to your final point, I don't want this to be a conversation of you wasting your evening to educate our audience. I
Not at all.
I do wonder if there is maybe specific calls that you could give people who are ready and willing and eager to engage, of some of the things that you would like to see participation in, or places you could direct them to that where there's opportunities for labor, attention, heat, like in the interest of kind of community building around this. If there's any direct call outs that you would want to make, and then we can close there. We can kind of talk about climate change if you want, and do the full BetaKit podcast experience. I want to make sure that, beyond the education standpoint, if there are things here, because again, Canadian VC is a really small game, and we have seen the explosion in Canadian tech become commensurate with the explosion of foreign investment dollars into Canadian tech. And I'm wondering if you would like to see more firms like yours across the country, if you would like to see existing firms co-leading these, participating. A lot of the work that you seem to be describing in your role as an investor, I think traditionally has been left to incubators and accelerators in Canada. And for the audience, I put air quotes there. Where are the hooks that engaged members of this ecosystem could start connecting together right now if they were willing and able? Like literally, what would make your day easier? Or what would be the email or outreach you'd actually want to receive? I think that's probably the most targeted way to start.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. Look, for Indigenous people in this country, the last 3 or 4 months have been pretty grim. What has been really pivotal for me as a intergenerational residential school survivor. My daughter's mom went to residential school. This is not a long time ago, and so there have been so many people in this sector and others who have reached out to just hold space, and there's a sort of a fundamental level of humanity that the tech sector doesn't always necessarily lend itself as well to. That there's a big container that's needed in this space for Indigenous people who are holding a lot. And the expectations for success in the VC space put people under huge amounts of pressure. And so that was a pre-existing lived reality to what is now going to be, a rolling train wreck of trauma that's just going to, bounce back and forth across our country for a long time to come. So one, I think is holding space and reaching out to say, I know that this happened. I may or may not know much about it, but I just wanted to see if there's anything that I can do to be supportive in that context. So there's a human element to that. The second is that, there are roadmaps that make people who kind of shrug and don't really know what to do. That makes that challenging when we hear that. So the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is something that we're now centering in our impact measurement, and we're now sharing into the impact management project and stakeholders in IMP, and GIN and the Common Approach here in Canada, and the big players in the global impact measurement movement in the investment space, to say, great, let's action the UN SDGs and contribute to the 2030 goals, but there's another global framework and there's another pathway which would make our lives vastly less barriered if the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was centered amongst people who take impact seriously alongside the SDGs. That is the big tectonic, that's the big swing. That's the big tectonic shift that will have a generational impact, and that will facilitate a massive transformation in the way that capital flows and the way that it behaves. So I would say that's the second. And the third is, here in Canada, we have the TRC, 6,700 residential school survivors told what happened to them when they were little for the first time, and most of them in public and most of them in front of strangers. And they're like, if you're a 60 or 70-year-old man, giving some of that graphic detail about what happened when you're 6 to strangers, that's on an individual scale, that's huge courage. But for that many people to have told their story, and then for us to have this roadmap of 94 calls to action, and for folks to say, still say to this day, which is infuriating, I don't know what to do. Here's another roadmap that is explicit. And then if that wasn't enough, we also have a legacy of murdered and missing Indigenous women. And as a dad of 4 Indigenous girls, and living in a country where the propensity is to harm them just because they're Indigenous women, and they don't have to be hitchhiking for that to happen. We have now also a national inquiry, again, another cause for reflection in 231 calls for justice. And there yet again is another set, a roadmap with a set of specific actions that folks can undertake. So it's hard to disentangle and synthesize a cause, effect, and a range of actions more than the years and hundreds of millions of dollars and tens of thousands of conversations that have gone into producing these roadmaps, right? And so I'd say, familiarize yourself with those documents and set upon addressing one or more of them at work and at home.
Really thought you were going to say deal flow. Paul,
TLDR.
This has been awesome. Thank you so much for doing this and just giving us a lens to focus on this conversation in a day that is still undecided for most. And I hope this can help set them and ground them in not only a vision, but truly ground them in the reality of where they're living in Canada right now. And we look forward to covering more of the companies that you invest in on BetaKit.
Thanks so much, guys. I appreciate it.
The BetaKit podcast is produced by BetaKit with support from TWG. Our producer is Katie Lohr, and our hosts are Rob Kennedy and me, Douglas Saltis. To learn more about how you can support this podcast, head to patreon.com/BetaKit.